Welcome to On the Middle East, the podcast of the award-winning media service Al Monitor, where each week we talk with the decision makers and thought leaders who are making the news and shaping the trends in the Middle East. Happy 2021, everybody. I'm Andrew Parasolidi, president of Al Monitor, and our guest today is Leila Hamadeh, co-founder and CEO of Finyal Media, based in Dubai. And Finyal provides one of the most exciting podcast platforms in the region, reflecting the dynamism and creativity of Arab youth who are using podcasts and other new media platforms for expression, culture, entertainment, and connection during these times of turbulence and change as we start the new year. Now, back in October, we discussed and reported on the 2020 Arab Youth Survey. And the bottom line from that study is that despite the prevalence of war, protests, pandemic, and economic crisis in many of the countries in the region, Arab youth, here defined as aged 18 to 24, have embraced realism, not ideology, in their view of the region. And their view of the region is distinctly modern and entrepreneurial, believing overwhelmingly, for example, in gender equality and in embracing a digital future. Yes, religion is still central to the identity of 40% of Arab youth, according to the survey, and tribe and Arab identity matters too. So the picture is mixed and overlapping, and the search for expression and authenticity ends up in this fluid, ever-changing media space, which Leila and I will discuss today. Leila Hamadeh is the CEO and co-founder of Finyal Media, where she is responsible for managing and driving overall growth of the business. She has extensive experience in the media and telecom industry. She's worked as a management consultant and in-house strategy expert for companies in Europe and the Middle East, including OSN, Fremantle Media, Etisalat, and Value Partners. Leila holds a BA from Oxford University and an executive MBA from London Business School. My conversation with Leila Hamadeh begins now. Leila, welcome to On the Middle East.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Leila, Finyal's mission, as you all describe it, is to tell stories that help young people reconnect with the Arab world by championing local culture in a modern way that's relatable to the younger generation. So let's start by telling us more about your assessment of media content in the Arab world, the niche your podcasts fill. You know, my experience is a baby boomer who was working in the region in the pre-millennial era, was that media before the digital era, not just in the region, but globally, was mostly kind of top-down, content highly regulated, limited platforms. Obviously, there was TV, radio, print, but that was then. Which genres now are coming out on top, especially with the millennial and post-millennial cohort group?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. And I think your assessment of the way the media industry in the region looked historically is a pretty accurate one, to be honest. I mean, the way the industry has evolved is that traditionally it was very much dominated by a few big players that were sort of leading the way in a sort of top-down approach. And I think the result of that was that, you have a huge generation of young people who've grown up in the region, not really seeing themselves represented in that media. Right. And I think as soon as, the trend started shifting towards digital, the way they have all over the world, I think this trend was sort of exacerbated in the region because people here, young people here, have been sort of looking for forums to be able to express themselves more freely, but also to be able to create content that feels a little bit more authentic and a little bit more representative of their generation. And I think for us, you know, we've seen this in the huge consumption or the huge consumption rates that you have on YouTube in the region, which are some of the highest on a per capita basis in the world. And we also see that in the podcasting space, which is, you know, where we saw an opportunity as Finyal Media to start creating content that would fill that gap in audio. And you know, myself and my two co-founders, Majid, who's Emirati, and Mashari, who is Saudi Kuwaiti, all came to this project, if you will, as three relatively young Arabs, I would say, not finding themselves or their identity represented in the media, and kind of wanting to change that and start creating content that was relatable, that felt authentic, that sort of speaks to young people, and kind of helps to bridge that gap between the traditions, the very strong traditions that we still have in the Arab world, but also the modern day lives that we're all kind of used to living now.
Oh, sorry, please go ahead. I mean, I was going to say, when I'm listening to your podcast, you know, I really get that sense of that fluidity and engagement between, you know, Arab youth and young people expressing themselves. And one thing I've noticed is some of your podcasts are in Arabic, some in English, some have both. And some, like Juha and Sinbad, those are traditional cultural stories, are in Arabic, and are targeted, it seems, at an even kind of younger cohort. You have guests from the West and the East. It seems, you know, as I mentioned, incredibly fluid. I was listening to Party Platforms, which is about food, and it was primarily Arabic, but drifted into English here and there with a guest from Virginia, here in the United States, I might add, my home state. So tell us about, you know, as you look at these genres and trends, tell us about language and media consumption and identity for both content providers and consumers in the region, because I think this is something you guys are at Finyal are very much onto and convey very well.
Yeah, good point. We do span a number of different languages in our shows, and I think, you know, if I sort of put some explanation around that, I mean, we have a couple of English language talk shows, Millennial Mirrors and Yalla, which were actually the first two shows that we produced. And the reason for doing them in English initially was mostly because, you know, as a startup team, we were based in Dubai and mainly targeting the UAE market. And it kind of makes sense when you're approaching a UAE-based audience to produce content in English. And it also made it a little bit easier to tackle some of the sort of social and cultural subjects in English than in Arabic, which are often sort of not talked about on other forms of media. But once we started moving to a more kind of regional play and trying to create content that was, you know, bringing in Arabs from across the region, it absolutely made sense for us to start creating content in Arabic. And of course, with that shift, we saw a huge increase in audience, and that's not just because, you know, the population in the MENA region is bigger than the population in the UAE, but it's also because when you talk to young Arabs over here and you ask them what sort of content you're looking for, it's quite surprising, because although they're kind of flooded with Hollywood content from every angle, and a lot of the sort of premium, in inverted commas, content that we see on some of the streaming platforms is what people are paying for, actually what they say in terms of what they're looking for is to have more local content that is based on their own history and their own culture. And I think the best way that you can champion that is by doing it, obviously, in the language of source. And the way we do that is by focusing on content that sort of, again, bridges that gap between the traditions of the region and the modern day lives. So you mentioned Juha, you mentioned Sindbad. We also have, 1001 Nights, which is one of our biggest shows, actually. And all of these stories are obviously very classic when it comes to Arab culture, but they're resonating so incredibly well with young people here. I mean, the vast majority of our audience is aged 18 to 25. And these are really kind of old stories that you might not think would resonate with that generation. But I think because the sort of cultural ties to the legacy of the region is so strong, we take those stories, we sort of adapt them by using very kind of dynamic voice acting. We take out any references that are no longer relevant in today's world. So any sort of sexism or racism that, wouldn't be appropriate today. And we re-script them in a way that young people can actually relate to. And that kind of content really, really works. And I think it's partly because it has it's rooted in such strong tradition. But I think it's also partly because people in the region are looking for escapism. And that's why entertainment does really, really well. And this has definitely been accelerated by the onset of COVID this year, where people have more and more been looking for content that helps them to escape from the day-to-day, to distract them. And by doing this in podcast form, it means they can be consuming the content while they're doing something else. And the kind of escapist element becomes really, really strong.
Do you see podcasts as a challenge to radio and TV, a complementary platform?
Yeah, I mean, I would say all of these platforms are complementary in a sense, because the way people consume podcast content is quite different from the way they consume video content, for example. People listen on their commute, or people listen in Saudi, especially, they listen while they're doing chores at home, or cooking in the kitchen and work around the house, that kind of thing. So they are complementary, but at the same time, I mean, the shift that we've seen from linear to on-demand content consumption happened a long time ago in the video world. And I think it's only just sort of starting to happen, at least in the Arab world, for the audio world. So there is certainly a generational difference in the way people consume audio content. I mean, young people here are not inclined to be listening to radio, and so that those ears are definitely turning towards podcast consumption, just because they're used to having everything on demand now. It's just linear is not an option, or not being able to choose when and how and what you listen to is not really an option for people under the age of 25.
My generation and prior, in dealing with the region, was that radio was really king for a long time. And I know here in the States, in those, there's also a podcast explosion as well. And some in radio see that as challenging to the traditional radio medium, because, again, you can have these exciting programs or fascinating discussions on demand, rather than having to, listen through commercials and content that may not always be of interest to you.
Yeah, absolutely. But at the end of the day, it's all content, right? And even if the delivery mechanism has to change, and that's why you see a lot of radio stations now moving into the podcasting space, even if the delivery mechanism has to change, the process of producing great content doesn't really change. And maybe it becomes more episodic, or there are slight changes to the formats that the content is created in. But really, there is so much room, I think, for even the radio stations here to start producing more podcast content. I mean, when you look at the supply that we have today of Arabic podcasts in a region of roughly 400 million people. I think we have barely 400 podcasts in Arabic. So, by anyone's standards, there is huge room for, a lot more players to come into this space, including the radio stations. And I think that will definitely help to grow the industry as a whole. So by our estimates, currently we're looking at, podcast penetration in the region of roughly 4 or 5% of the population, compared to somewhere like the US where you are, where it's 50-60% these days and growing.
Right.
So I think, the more supply that we have from all types of content providers in the region, the faster we can get to those really high penetration rates over here as well.
As CEO, you have the business lead at Finyal. How do you see the trend in the region for free versus paid content? And what are the barriers and opportunities to monetization for podcast platforms like yours? And do you seek corporate sponsors for your programs? Do you rely on advertising? How do you see that trend in the business?
Yeah, good question. So the Arab world has really historically relied very much on advertising as a means of funding media. So whether it's the big TV players like NBC or the global social media platforms that are very big here, YouTube and Facebook, it's all sort of advertising driven. And there is, I think, a couple of reasons for that. One is that piracy here has been very rife for a long time. And the second is that there is a bit of a perception among Arabs about the value of local content versus Western content. And I think part of the reason that some sort of pay TV or subscription platforms took a long time to take off were because people were willing to pay for Western content, but not necessarily for Arabic content, just because of those a sort of a perception of a difference in value, I guess, for the consumer. But it does feel like that is changing, and that has changed quite a lot over the last couple of years. So recently we've seen quite significant growth in subscription services in the region. So on the sort of video streaming side, Netflix and Stars Play are both really big in the region now. And I think generally, it's the same as the sort of global trend for these players. But generally, there is a lot more of an appetite to pay for these kind of content, and a lot better ways for content providers like ourselves to actually access the consumer and break down the barriers of sort of payment methods and things like that. So what a lot of subscription services do is partner with the telecom players so that they can use them to help people that don't have credit cards, for example, pay for the content. So there are a lot of sort of infrastructure changes, that are a lot of changes in the ecosystem that mean that the potential for paid content by consumers as opposed to paid content by advertisers is starting to take off. And I think, over the next couple of years, we'll see a lot more of that. And that will be a big opportunity, not just for video, but also for audio. And I think in the podcasting space, we'll definitely start to see more sort of subscription-based content that is not just reliant on advertising.
Let me ask about one program that seems to have gotten a lot of attention called The Basement. And yeah, this is what you've said is the first original fictional mystery thriller podcast series. This seems a lot of work in terms of production, much more than the standard interview podcasts. Tell us about how you're thinking about it, and how has it been received, and is it generating a lot of interest in terms of listeners?
It has, yes. So you're definitely right that it has been it's been a big undertaking in terms of what we wanted to do with The Basement. It is the first original drama series that's ever been created in podcast form for the region. And, you know, scripted fiction is something that has worked quite well in places like the US. And, you know, when we look at TV and other platforms, you know, drama series are, you know, the biggest genre for consumption on those platforms. So it made a lot of sense for us to sort of replicate that, but in podcast form. Now, it was a big risk because it's not something that has been done before. And although a lot of our other fictional shows, we do have other fictional shows, they're more sort of short stories, and they're more based on existing stories from our past. So this one is very contemporary. It's based around a fictional character, Fadi, who is basically a washed up YouTube star, an Egyptian guy who is looking to reclaim his fame and discovers a sort of box of old tapes in his basement when he moves into a new house, starts replaying those tapes, and discovers that it's the ramblings of this psychopath who was stalking his neighbor, and sets out to kind of uncover that mystery. Now, it's been the reception has been pretty incredible, actually, and one of the things that we're most excited about is that, you know, we have obviously feedback from our listeners all the time, whether it's on the podcasting apps or people writing to us directly. And one of the things that we've noticed with this show, which is very different, is that the response we're getting is people thinking that the central fictional character is actually real, because it's a very realistic style. And so we're getting comments that are addressed directly to Fadi himself, who is a made-up character, sort of saying, hang in there, Fadi, you know, don't listen to the haters. So I guess this is a good sign that it's realistic, at least, and it's resonating well with people.
That's fantastic. Let me ask about my favorite podcast, Millennial Mirrors, and I find this program not only speaks to young Arab influencers, but really taps into how youth are using media for expression. And as the host of the show and your partner and co-founder, Masheri El-Nazi, describes it, between contentment and success. And the topics have included things like, how does what you create reflect you, and determination, and using your platform for purpose. Tell me what you continue to learn from this program about Arab youth culture and influencers, and where you see these trends going.
Yeah, so Millennial Mirrors was originally crafted by Mashari because he was working in the Kuwaiti oil sector at the time, and he saw, I think, a big disconnect between the sort of upper management of the companies he was working with, who were more sort of traditional Kuwaitis, and the young people that were coming into the company and their sort of aspirations and the way they wanted to live their lives. And I think he sort of set about trying to bridge that gap by addressing some of the topics that are, you know, really at the forefront of young people's minds in the region, but that are usually not addressed or talked about in traditional Arab culture. So by addressing things like shame, which is a big part of something that people often say to their children, or and things like that in Arab families, addressing sort of self-acceptance, what it really means to be a man, what it really means to be a woman in today's society. I think, you know, for us, it was about opening those topics up and allowing people a kind of safe place to have those discussions, which they couldn't do on other channels and they couldn't do in other platforms. And yes, you know, some of the interviews are with influencers, but I think for us, it was less about having, you know, big names and more about having people that were qualified to talk on the subject in a way that people would relate to. And sometimes that means, with the generation that that we have in our audience, sometimes that means bringing people that they recognize or they know from social media, and using them to allow young people to realize it's okay to have these discussions, and give them a forum for expressing that.
These feelings and ideas and worldviews that are reflected in that program are really different, across generations. And like you say, dealing with issues of shame and identity and what's it mean to be a man and what's it mean to be successful and happy. Many of these issues just aren't understood across generations, sometimes not understood across cultures. And listening to the guests on your show talk about that has really been an experience for me, and understanding even more how not only Arab youth, but I think this generation of people who look to these mediums for, like you say, a safe outlet of expression, and people who are looking to media more and more people looking to media for expression.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was the other show that we did initially, that my co-founders started, Majid and Mashari, was called Yalla, and was similar in that, it was effectively about them starting up a podcast business. And a big part of that was, how do we fail along the way? Right. And I think the reason it kind of resonated with people here was, people are not used to listening to two Khalijis talking about their failures. Right. Like, that is not a thing that is usually done in media. It's everything is usually very glamorous here. It's sort of we gloss over things, to make them look pretty. And I think, having that kind of authentic feel and inviting people into that process and showing them that, some things go well and some things don't go so well was really powerful.
It is powerful, and it's a life lesson. The degrees of success sometimes aren't just incremental, but can be some start-stop. And that's what it is, even for the most successful people, and that matters. And for people to be okay with that in a culture sometimes where, success is everything. And, oh my gosh, I've been set back in my life for whatever reason, to hear that, yeah, we went through that too. And let me tell you about it. And let me tell you what we learned and how we got to another place.
Exactly. Everything is a journey.
Right, indeed. Well, look, Leila, I've really enjoyed this conversation. As you can tell, I'm a fan of what you're doing at Finyal Media with your podcasts. I appreciate your time today and talking with us on the Middle East.
Thank you, Andrew. It's been such a pleasure talking to you. Appreciate it.
I will be right back after this short break.
I'm Ben Caspit, Al Monitor veteran columnist reporting from Israel, one of the world's major news and action suppliers of all times, comparing to its tiny size. I've been covering and analyzing the political, diplomatic, and military arenas in Israel for over 34 years. My best-selling biography, The Netanyahu Years, was out 2 years ago. I covered 7 prime ministers, 1 major war, 2 intifadas, 1 prime minister's assassination, 2.5 peace treaties, 4 military operations in Gaza, and it's not letting up anytime soon. I'm glad to invite you to On Israel, our brand new podcast, where we will discuss major events in Israel and its surroundings, talk to decision makers, leaders, and analysts, and try to understand the chaos that comes with the territory of Israel and the Middle East. You will never have a dull moment with us. See you soon here on Israel, Al Monitor.
Thank you all for listening to On the Middle East, and thanks to our production team of Phil Calabro of Al Monitor and Beowulf Roshland of Two Square Media Productions. We will be back next weekend. In the meantime, please sign up for this and our other Al Monitor podcast on Israel at your favorite podcast platform.